Super Mario 64 is kind of a weird Mario game. Yeah, it's focused on platforming, but it's even more focused on collecting and, by extension, exploring. You gotta run around these little mini worlds, picking up coins and stars and crap like that. Past the first little bit of the game, you can select and complete levels in a load of different orders. None of the classic power-ups appear. Mario's primary way of beating down his enemies is punching and kicking them. But think about 2D Mario games. The closest thing to item collection stemming from those early games were the Yoshi coins or whatever they're called. You know, from Super Mario World. And I still don't even know what those things were for. Super Mario Sunshine is even weirder. It abandoned typical Mario level archetypes for a single aesthetic, a tropical paradise. Beyond that, Flood radically changed how platforming and combat worked. But there were a small number of levels that resembled the old linear style of 2D Mario levels adapted into the third dimension. Here, Flood was ripped off Mario's back. The safety net was pulled away. For many, these were a highlight, if not the highlight, of the game. On the surface, Super Mario Galaxy seems to build upon the foundation laid by these two games. There are loads of different planets to explore, many of them with about 6 stars to collect. After the first little bit, the game opens up and levels can be tackled in many different orders. The player still collects power stars. But regardless of these simple similarities, Galaxy's level design has more in common with the 2D games than the 3D games, because most of these missions are linear platforming challenges with little in the way of exploration. This way, Galaxy changed the direction of 3D Mario going forward. These games were no longer collectathons. First and foremost, they were now focused on platforming-based challenges. This trend Galaxy set would persist for 10 years, all the way until Super Mario Odyssey brought the 3D Mario games back to their more collectathon-style gameplay. Of course, many people rejoiced at this prospect. Finally, 3D Mario was returning to its 3D roots. And I understand that because, well, I was also pretty excited about that. I wanted to experience another 3D Mario game that was a bit more like this, and not so much like this. Even so, it's easy for me to see why Nintendo stuck with this more linear style for 4 games straight. Because Super Mario Galaxy is one of Nintendo's best games.
Super Mario Galaxy!
From its opening cutscene, it's clear that Galaxy is concerned with making this game feel like an adventure. The cutscene is shockingly cinematic, full of intense camera angles, moving characters, explosions, all that stuff. Feels like the opening to an action movie. Sure, the Mushroom Kingdom has been invaded before, but this is the first time it's truly felt like it's absolutely under attack. Here, Bowser isn't some goofy villain, he's a force of nature. Just immediately before this game, he was some weird dad that lied to his son about where he stuck his turtle doink. Now his B-movie voice is replaced with grunts and growls, and he isn't just determined to capture the princess, he's determined to take over the world and the universe. Bowser, more than ever before, feels like something to be reckoned with. The cinematic flair of the battles with him add to this too. In particular, the music makes tackling Bowser feel similar to taking on an army of orcs. Overall, the music gives the world life and energy. There's the playful xylophones and guitar riff of HONEYHIVE Galaxy, the almost militant snare drum, strings, and brass of BATTLEROCK Galaxy, the spooky, deep piano tones and ambient percussion of Deep Dark Galaxy, and, well, I could go on and on. Honestly, the soundtrack is worthy of a video all its own. Each piece so perfectly encapsulates the tone of the galaxy or galaxies it's used in. And while the game's more bombastic moments are integral to its adventure, the quiet of space is just as important. Despite having access to a full orchestra for this whole soundtrack, plenty of pieces pare things back a lot, relying on synths to give the game this spacey feel that is obviously quite fitting. Without this element, without this attention to detail and this restraint on the part of the composer, Mario Galaxy simply wouldn't feel like Mario Galaxy. There's this room to breathe within the music, a room for silence and for other sound effects to pop up and really stand out. Running around on the various planets only feels so alive because everything about the soundscape is so carefully considered. One of my favorite parts of the music comes from the COMET observatory. As the player goes through the game, there are set points when the music will build upon itself, more instruments getting added in as the observatory comes to life. This way, the sound in the game manages to reflect how the game physically looks at this moment, and that's how it is throughout the game's entire run. The music is consistently reflecting and enhancing what is visually shown to the player. It's because of this music that the game has such a thick, dense atmosphere, and it's one of the reasons why I can get lost in it so easily. Part of the game's fantastic atmosphere also comes down to its willingness to tell a story, no matter how small that story may be. Of course, other Mario games have had small stories as well, gotta save the princess, Peach's baking a cake, all that stuff. But Rosalina's optional storybook in the library is something different entirely. It gives the observatory itself a narrative purpose as well as a gameplay purpose. In doing so, again, the world manages to feel so much more alive than it otherwise would. It's one of those things that's hard for me to describe in words because it's all about a feeling, about the fact that I can turn on this game and get lost in it so quickly. Part of the reason for getting lost is that I'm having fun, but part of it is also that it feels like I'm in a different space, in a different world. It's this sense of immersion that is particularly special in video games, and when video games manage to really tap into that for me, I get invested. It's hard to pull myself away, and I know I can continually return to that world because even if maybe I could eventually have enough of the gameplay or level design or character control, it's hard to find a game with an atmosphere quite like this one. This atmosphere alone elevates it above many other games and keeps me coming back to it time and time again. In my opinion, Galaxy's biggest flaw is that gameplay is interrupted far too frequently. Let's consider the beginning of the game. There's this short story bit, which introduces the player to the Star Festival and to the fact that, once again, Peach is out here baking cakes and, getting kidnapped. Next, the player runs forward, then another cutscene. Then the player runs forward again, then another cutscene. Don't worry though, I might have a bad memory, but I haven't already forgotten about part 1 of this video. I know that this cutscene contributes a lot to the tone of the game, and I think that's a worthy trade-off. Even so, it's not a necessary trade-off. Many players are going to play these games more than once, and that's why it's crucial to let players skip this stuff. Without that option, these cutscenes manage to obstruct playing the game. As I've already said, I like to return to Mario Galaxy frequently, but I don't necessarily need to watch this cutscene again and again. The same issue pops up when the player goes to fight Bowser and defeats him, because there's more cutscenes, and then the player's gotta sit through the credits. Skipping cutscenes is such a basic and simple thing that it's hard to believe a game with this level of polish can miss that. But game developers forget that with a fair amount of frequency, and Mario Galaxy is no different. Still, this isn't a huge issue for me. The bigger issue are these little interruptions that keep popping up throughout the whole game's run. If the player wants to see where comets are hanging out, they've got to go back to the start of the hub area, even though having this map pop up when the player pauses would have worked. When new characters begin hanging around the observatory, the player gets pulled back to the start to get told about them. When the player collects green stars, once again, back to the start. In all these cases, the player then has to run back to the level they want to play. Running around a bit is fine and all, but there's really no reason for these interruptions to be here. The player doesn't need to get pulled back to the start. Another big source of interruptions comes from the comets. For some reason, these guys don't like sticking around in the same spot for long. But if you feed this big boy 20 star bits, he'll do a happy dance and move them around for you. This means that the player, once again, is going to need to run back to the start to move around the comets. This only really bothered me once the purple comets came up, but it was a pretty big deal at that point. Overall, it's hard to understand why comets are laid out this way, because another thing with them is that if they're on a level, you can't select any other star in that level. So if there's a comet there, you gotta do that comet star. If this weren't the case, comets could have just gradually appeared on levels and the player could have tackled them at their own pace. I'm sure the designers had some sort of reason for this that my smooth brain can't comprehend, but once comets appear, why can't I just go do those missions whenever I want? Overall, the observatory just doesn't add much to the game in terms of gameplay. The hub worlds of Mario 64 and Sunshine worked because they served as playgrounds to practice Mario's controls and had secret areas of their own. Here, the observatory doesn't really accurately replicate the way playing the game usually feels. It's flat, fairly small, and not open. As such, it's hard to test many of your abilities here, and there's no opportunity to run around on spheres and practice that out. It's at this point I have to ask, was the hub world even a good idea? I've already talked about how it adds to the game's sense of progression, tone, and narrative, so all that stuff works well. But it has a fairly negative impact on gameplay, and I can't help but feel that it could have been integrated better. Even so, these stumbling blocks don't stop the game from being great and even masterful, because the vast majority of time playing this game is still spent, well, actually playing the game, and it is a glorious game to play. In Sunshine, Mario's controls were expanded in a variety of ways. Just like in 64, he could belly flop, side flip, and back flip, but he couldn't kick, punch, or long jump. However, FLUDD effectively replaced these moves with more complex water-based movement mechanics and attack options. Naturally, players might expect that Galaxy would continue this trend of, overall, making Mario's controls more expansive. Instead, Mario's controls are pared back a bit. He's regained his long jump, but FLUDD is gone. Mario's belly flop, kicks, and punches are also absent. In their place, Mario gets this little spin that acts as a sort of double jump and an attack at the same time. This way, players can course correct a bit better, and it certainly makes some of this tricky gravity-based platforming a lot more inviting. All in all, Mario's controls might not be quite as in-depth as they were in the previous 3D Mario games, but they fit this game's focus on tighter platforming exceptionally well. Even the simple introduction of way more bottomless pits than the previous game makes this little spin jump a godsend. Galaxy introduces the player to its controls in weird sphere-based platforming by asking them to chase and catch rabbits on a sphere. It's a simple way to ensure players have a baseline level of proficiency with the game's movement before throwing them to the wolves. Even better, on subsequent playthroughs, the player will be able to catch these rabbits faster. As such, this isn't some stupid tutorial that locks you into it time and time again, reading text prompts and getting bored. Instead, it's just another chunk of playing that happens to be introducing the player to a key idea. These invisible tutorials are the best type of tutorial, and Galaxy is full of them from start to finish. It's easy to take this gravity and sphere-based movement for granted because the game makes it feel so natural, but I'm sure that it was no simple task. As far as I know, there's no other game before this one that has platforming that so frequently involves running around on areas that look like this. Basically, in order for this to work, the designers needed to do an amazing job of communicating to the player. The player needs to know when they will stick to a surface and when they'll fall to their doom. Enemies are used first and foremost. After all, if they can stick to a surface, the player knows they can too. Meanwhile, arrows are used, especially in 2D sections, to represent the direction gravity will pull the player in. Black holes show where the player will get sucked up. Sometimes sticky platforms will simply be a different color or have different texturing. I'm sure there are loads of more subtle ways I'm missing, but that's really the point. It rarely feels like the game is telling you that it's safe to do this or that it's dangerous to do that. I just know, and the reasoning behind that fades into the background. And that's one of the best types of communication to have with the player. It shows a very strong grasp of player psychology. All the other fancy stuff Galaxy does wouldn't mean much if it didn't get the basics right. But fortunately for us, the game's designers really nail the basics. Galaxy's missions are crafted with a similar level of care. Because of its more segmented and linear design, Galaxy is built with challenge introduction and escalation in mind. For example, in Bowser Jr.'s robot reactor, the player begins by guiding bullet bills to these glass containers and breaking them. On the planet, there are some weak enemies and holes, so the player needs to be careful, but this challenge is straightforward enough. Next, the player needs to guide a bullet bill here to crack this container during the Mega Legs boss fight. After that, gates pop up, and the player needs to guide a bullet bill into it. If the player takes too much time, new gate pieces pop up. So now the challenge doesn't just involve leading bullet bills to crack containers open, it involves doing it fast enough and with more care. Meanwhile, Sweet Galaxy has these hole-filled platforms that get more complex. Space Junk Galaxy's second star involves throwing turtle shells. BattleRock Galaxy's first star is focused on these sphere-based platforms. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. Galaxy is constantly introducing new ideas and mechanics to the player, but it's done with such care that it never becomes overwhelming or even all that noticeable. As the game goes on, the designers are more free to mix and match challenges. Challenges won't exactly line up with one another, and the game becomes less focused on simple introduction and escalation. There's more of a focus on variety, on tossing a bunch of ideas the player's way to create a sense of unpredictability. For example, even at the end of BattleRock Galaxy's first star, the player needs to guide a bullet bill to another glass enclosure. The rest of the level doesn't have anything to do with bullet bills, but this works because this level takes place after Bowser Jr.'s robot reactor. So the designers know that the player is already familiar with this mechanic and idea, and now they can sprinkle it in where they see fit. The Sling Pod Galaxy is similar, beginning and ending with challenges that involve flinging Mario off these things. In the middle, though, the player needs to use pull stars to guide Mario through obstacles. While both these challenges involve careful use of the Wiimote's pointer, the pull stars are still a different type of challenge that the designer knows the player will be at least somewhat familiar with by now. Part of this variety also comes in the form of various camera angles. Above head, behind the back, and 2D views are all used to great effect. But while much of this game has challenge escalation based around specific mechanics or platforming styles, there are small bursts of exploration. These usually come in the form of pull star pieces, launch star pieces, or silver stars. Once one of these appears, the player knows there will be 4 more to collect. When all 5 are collected, the player will either be able to continue on with the level or get the star itself. Players will need to check each nook and cranny of these planets to find each piece. Admittedly, these planets don't really have that many nooks and crannies to speak of though. Even so, these sections serve as a welcome change of pace when they do pop up, and allow the designers to slow the pace of the game a little when they see fit. It's yet another way the game has variety. Some variety comes in the form of motion control style gimmick levels too. Of course, these are liable to be a bit more contentious. Plenty of people don't want anything to do with motion control BS, and trust me, I understand. The fact that I need to shake my whole Switch if I want to play Odyssey in handheld mode will never fail to fill me with man rage. but I think most of the motion control based stuff here is well done and well integrated. Of course, motion controls are used to perform Mario's spin move. As the majestic Matthewmatosis said in his review of the game, this use of motion control relies on the player's natural inclinations. After all, many novice players will naturally flail their arms a bit if they're falling into a pit, so this builds upon that instinct. To spin in midair, just flick your wrist. It would have been ideal if a button could have also been used to do the same thing, but the Wiimote doesn't exactly have any other buttons in great spots for that. The only time it was a problem for me was when I was trying to cook dinner and play at the same time like a degenerate, but something tells me that isn't exactly a universal problem. Most often, the Wiimote's pointer functionality is used. This comes up with pull stars, fling pods, and bubble sections. It's also used to collect star bits. The Wiimote's pointer is easily the most consistent part of its motion controls and will rarely, if ever, go off course so long as the player has the sensor bar set up properly. In my opinion, it fills this gameplay purpose better than an analog stick ever could. Of course, collecting star bits maybe could have worked with a second analog stick, but players would have to take their fingers away from some buttons to do that. This way, players can run around like they always do and collect star bits at the same time. On top of that, players can shoot enemies with star bits to stun them. Overall, this throws some nice multitasking into the mix, along with gameplay variety. It's yet another way to make an already engaging game even more engaging. The motion controls aren't integrated quite as well in these ball and manta racing sections though. With the ball, players need to hold the controller like a joystick and bend it around to move the ball. But without any sort of physical feedback, this challenge really leaves something to be desired. There's no tension to a Wiimote being suspended in the air, beyond the tension of your hand and wrist as you move them around. Here, the challenge isn't making your way through the obstacle course itself, it's controlling the ball itself. Just like with tutorials, I generally like if controls to a game are mostly invisible, as in you become so used to them that you stop thinking about them. To be fair, this is a bit of a limiting perspective. There can definitely be fun to be had with control schemes in games that require you to think about it a bit more. If this were to come up a lot throughout the Mario games, which usually pride themselves on having controls that fade into the background as the player gains more and more ability with Mario himself, this would be a problem. But fortunately, this challenge only comes up a few times throughout the game, and it's usually relegated to its own level entirely, meaning that players could beat Bowser without ever having encountered one of these parts of the game. The manta racing sections suffer from a similar problem. Here, the player needs to hold the Wiimote flat and twist it like a key to move left and right. Again, the only tension here comes from the player's wrist, and the challenge doesn't come from getting through the obstacle course. It comes from controlling your way through it at all. This is also optional though, so it's hard to get all riled up about it. Like most of the other levels, these motion control focused ones are linear in design, but the game also has some exploratory style levels too. HONEYHIVE, Beach Bowl, Gold Leaf, Sea Slide, and Deep Dark Galaxy. What I mean by exploratory is that these levels all involve large areas that stay the same across missions, where what the player needs to do isn't so immediately obvious. In other words, the player needs to explore around a bit more. These levels are the closest the game gets to 64 and Sunshine's style of design. But these levels are still pretty segmented. Most of the stars in these areas have their fair share of unique sections that can't be accessed at all if the player hasn't selected a specific star. The player will usually get launched to different planets that don't lead back to the main area of the galaxy. However, I think that the exploratory design tilt of these levels is still their greatest strength in Galaxy. Because of this, I also think that it would have been best to lean into that aspect of their design. There are two obvious ways the designers could have done this, a relatively easy way and a hard way. The easy way would have been to make it possible to get the stars in whatever order the player wants to, but still kick them out of the level upon getting a power star. The best galaxy for illustrating what I'm talking about is the Beach Bowl galaxy. This one has 4 main stars. First, the player needs to swim around this area collecting launch star pieces. Then the player needs to climb up these ledges and grab the star. Second, the player needs to grab this gold shell from the penguins in the water and bring it back to the chunky penguin to get a star. Third, the player needs to go into the water again, grab a shell, break this wall, and then go through this stone cyclone in the sky. Fourth, the player needs to throw a shell at this treasure chest over here and launch over to a different planet, completing a challenge there. In all these levels, the player needs to do some exploring of the main area before getting the star. One way to make these levels feel less segmented would be to make all the stars available from the get-go. So if the player wanted to collect the gold shell first, they could do that. And if the player wanted to break this wall first, they could do that too, and so on. Once the player collects the star, they would still get booted out of the stage. But I think this would have been a good way of leaning into the inherent strengths of these level types. The harder way would be to make it that players never have to get booted out of these levels at all. Instead, the player would be able to continue exploring after getting a power star. Of course, this would mean that after collecting the stars on these places in the sky, new paths would have to open up to get the player back to the main area. I don't know much about the technical side of game creation, but I imagine that could cause some difficulty. But I really think even the easy way would have been a bit of an improvement. Regardless, I still think these exploratory style galaxies are a worthy addition to the game. They're yet another way the game includes variety in its many levels and challenges. Overall, Galaxy's level design is simply impeccable. Immediately after collecting 120 stars, I was ready to go back and play again. And that's because there's so much here. So many ideas, so many twists on platforming challenges. Through and through, it's an exceptionally fun game. But despite the many challenges present here, that's not to say that the game doesn't repeat itself, because the game repeats itself quite a lot, at least if you're looking to get all 120 power stars. This repetition mainly comes in the form of comets. I've already mentioned some problems with how comets appear in the game and how the player has to select them, but there's also problems with the challenges themselves. Many of them are time-based challenges which task the player with completing the level in a certain amount of time, or faster than a Cosmic Mario clone. Both of these are functionally the same though. You have to beat it fast enough. Unfortunately, more skilled players likely will have already done this, because the player isn't encountering new tasks, they're redoing old tasks with new restrictions. So if you're good enough, maybe you already completed the level fast enough. In that case, it's a shame that you need to go back and do it again. The same issue comes up with Daredevil comets. With these, players need to beat part of the level or a boss fight without being hit once. Again, if the player is skilled enough, they might have already done this. Overall, I think it's just not a good idea to make content that only feels new to players if they aren't good enough at the game. An easy way to get around this would have been to reward skilled players with 2 power stars upon completing challenges like this. So even if the timer wasn't on the level, there could be a sort of invisible timer keeping track of how fast the player is going. If they go fast enough, then they get 2 stars at the end of the level. This would encourage skilled players to also be on their toes for the whole game, and to also do their best throughout because there might be a second star in it for them. But none of these issues with comets come anywhere close to the issues that come with purple comets. See, purple comets will only appear after Bowser's final version has been defeated for the first time. This means that if the player wants to 100% complete the game by getting all 120 power stars and eventually unlocking Luigi, they're going to need to fight Bowser twice. Needing to fight him twice doesn't really make much sense and makes the game feel rather anticlimactic, because now you gotta fight him and then do all these other missions and then go fight him again. When I was playing through it for this review, I forgot that you needed to beat him the first time to get the purple comets to appear. So that meant that I collected almost all the other stars that were available, realized that no more comets were showing up, went to go fight him, and only then did new comets appear. As such, all the purple comets appeared towards the end of the game, meaning that I kept doing purple coin missions back to back. I think these missions in and of themselves are good to have in the game. With these missions, the player needs to now explore these levels more thoroughly than they did before. It's a treasure hunt style challenge that not everyone will enjoy, but I enjoy well enough. And yet I didn't really enjoy these missions because they were all smushed together. If I'd been able to do them throughout the game at my own pace, only selecting them when I really felt like doing them, there would have been no problem. In fact, it would have been another great way the game has variety. Instead, what should have been more variety became sheer repetition, as I went back to all these levels that I'd already beaten, that I'd already explored quite thoroughly, and had to do that again. The obvious solution to this problem is to have the purple comets appear along with the other ones. This way the player doesn't need to defeat Bowser twice, and they'll be able to play these levels more at their own pace. I really can't see a negative to this option. There are definitely flaws with the game I've discussed here, but I can't say that any of them held my attention for that long, because I kept getting pulled into the atmosphere again, into the level design, into the varied locations and challenges that I saw throughout the course of the game. When there's so much good here, it's hard to get hung up on the bad. In fact, it's easy to forget that the bad stuff even exists at all. It's for that reason that I still think Super Mario Galaxy is a masterpiece and one of Nintendo's greatest games. But fortunately, Nintendo didn't abandon the ideas in Super Mario Galaxy here, because there's a whole sequel to discuss, and I'll be discussing it soon in an upcoming video. If you'd like to be notified about that video, remember to subscribe to the channel. Also, I do streams on Twitch if you're interested in that sort of thing. Either way, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day. See you next time.